I knew from the moment he stepped into my house. The way he carried himself, too comfortable, too familiar. The way his eyes flicked toward my wife, Hannah, searching for something unspoken between them. And the way she gave it to him. A smile, a fleeting glance, a silent exchange that they thought went unnoticed. But I saw everything. And so, I did something they never expected. I welcomed him in. Hannah had introduced him as Daniel, an old friend from college who had fallen on hard times. He needed a place to stay just for a while, she said, her voice light, casual, rehearsed. I had simply smiled, nodding along, as if I believed every word, as if I didn't already know who he really was. I shook his hand, gripping it just a little too tight. "Make yourself at home," I said. And with that, the game began. The first few days were almost amusing. Daniel tiptoed around me, polite, careful. He laughed too easily at my jokes, agreed too quickly with my opinions. Hannah, on the other hand, overcompensated. She was suddenly more affectionate, more attentive, kissing me goodnight when she hadn't in months, cooking meals she never used to bother with, desperate to keep up the illusion, desperate to make sure I didn't notice. But I did. I noticed the stolen glances, the way their conversations would die the moment I entered the room, the late-night whispers behind closed doors, the hurried footsteps when I came too close. They thought they were being clever. They thought I was blind. But I was watching, waiting, letting them trap themselves. Because soon they'd learn. A man who pretends not to notice is far more dangerous than a man who doesn't know at all. Daniel had been living in my house for a week now. A week of polite conversations, forced smiles, and carefully measured movements. A week of watching them, waiting for their secrets to unravel. They thought they were clever. They thought I was blind. But I saw everything. Hannah played the role of a loving wife too well. She would kiss me on the cheek in the mornings, lingering just a second too long, as if overcompensating for her sins. She laughed at my jokes more than usual, her voice a little too high, a little too forced. Daniel was no better. He was a guest in my house, yet he moved like he belonged. His hand would rest on the back of Hannah's chair for just a second too long. His eyes would flick toward mine when he thought I wasn't looking, searching for signs of suspicion. I gave him nothing. I let them think they were safe. I let them believe their secret was still hidden. But at night, when the house was silent, I worked. I started with her phone. Hannah had always been careful, always keeping it close, always tilting the screen away from me. But all it took was a single moment, one careless mistake. She had left it charging in the kitchen. I picked it up, my pulse steady, my fingers moving quickly. A locked screen, but I knew her passcode. A swipe, a tap, messages. There they were, hidden in a conversation labeled work project. I smirked. How original. I scrolled up, my eyes scanning the messages. Hannah, he doesn't suspect anything. Daniel, are you sure? Hannah, I'm telling you, he has no idea. Daniel, I hate sneaking around like this. Hannah, asterisk just a little longer. Soon we won't have to hide. Asterisk, a little longer? I felt a slow, creeping smile stretch across my face. They had plans. How cute. The next move was mine. I started with small things. Psychological pressure. Mind games. Just enough to plant seeds of doubt. One morning, I casually mentioned a hotel in town. I heard they've got great security cameras, I said over breakfast, sipping my coffee. People can't get away with anything these days. Hannah froze mid-bite. Daniel barely moved, but I saw the way his hand tightened around his fork. Good. That evening, I took things a step further. We were in the living room watching some mindless show. Hannah sat beside me, Daniel on the opposite couch. I leaned back, stretching lazily. You ever hear about that study? I said suddenly. The one about people who think they're getting away with something? Hannah glanced at me. What? I smirked. Psychologists say people who keep secrets get paranoid. They start seeing signs that aren't there, hearing things that don't exist. I turned my gaze to Daniel. Like, for example, they might start thinking someone knows. The air in the room shifted. Daniel's smile flickered, just for a second. Hannah let out a forced laugh. That's ridiculous, she muttered, looking away. But I had seen it. A crack in their armor. Tiny, perfect fracture. And soon, I was going to tear it wide open. I had them right where I wanted them. Every carefully placed word, every subtle glance, every calculated moment of doubt was working its way under their skin. Hannah was more tense these days. More jumpy. Daniel? He had started watching me. Not in an obvious way, not yet. But I could feel it. The way his eyes lingered a second too long when I entered the room. The way he hesitated before speaking. They were getting nervous. And that was exactly what I wanted. That night, I decided to push them further. Hannah was in the kitchen making dinner. Daniel was sitting on the couch, flipping through his phone. I sat across from him, silent, watching. He noticed. After a few minutes, he cleared his throat. Something on your mind, man? I smiled, taking a sip of my drink. Just thinking. He forced a chuckle. About what? I tilted my head slightly. Secrets. The glass in his hand wobbled slightly before he steadied it. Secrets. I nodded, tapping my fingers against my knee. You ever notice how liars always give themselves away? Daniel shifted, suddenly very interested in his phone. I guess. I leaned forward, lowering my voice slightly. They think they're being careful, but their guilt seeps through the cracks. A slip of the tongue, a nervous glance, a hesitation. I let the words sink in before taking another slow sip of my drink. Daniel didn't move, didn't breathe. I watched the subtle twitch of his jaw, the way his fingers clenched around his phone. He was feeling it now. And Hannah? I glanced toward the kitchen just in time to see her standing in the doorway, completely still. She had heard everything. Later that night, I saw them whispering. They were in the hallway, their voices low. I didn't need to hear the words. I could read their body language. Daniel's stance was tense, arms crossed. Hannah's hands moved as she spoke, desperate, trying to reassure him. I almost laughed. They were unraveling. And they didn't even know how deep into my web they had already fallen. The whispers between them became more frequent. Hannah and Daniel thought they were being careful, keeping their voices low, stepping away whenever I entered a room. But the human mind is a fragile thing, and paranoia has a way of making people careless. Their secret was no longer a source of pleasure. It was becoming a weight, and I was making sure it crushed them. I started planting small traps. Nothing too obvious, just enough to poke at their guilt, to keep them constantly second-guessing themselves. The first was the wine glass. One night after dinner, I poured myself a drink, swirling the deep red liquid in my glass. I let my eyes linger on the rim before setting it down on the table, directly across from where Daniel sat. Funny thing about wine glasses, I mused, watching as he lifted his own. You can tell a lot from a lipstick stain. Daniel's grip tightened. Hannah froze. I waited, let the moment stretch, then smiled as if nothing was wrong. But I saw it. The flicker of panic in Hannah's eyes. She had been careful, wiping away evidence, hiding her tracks. But she couldn't wipe away guilt. A few days later, I laid another trap. I left my watch in the living room, placed deliberately on the coffee table. The same watch I had always kept in our bedroom. That night, after Hannah had gone to bed, I walked into the kitchen where Daniel was finishing a late-night snack. He looked up, trying too hard to be casual. Can't sleep, I smiled. No, just realized I left my watch out here. I picked it up, running my fingers over the polished metal. Then, without looking at him, I said, it's weird. I always leave it on my nightstand. Can't imagine how it ended up here. Daniel's chewing slowed. Maybe Hannah moved it? I finally turned to him. Maybe, I said. Or maybe someone just forgot to put it back. His face paled slightly. I walked away before he could stammer out a reply. The tension between them grew thicker. Hannah was edgy, her movements sharper, her eyes darting to me whenever she thought I wasn't looking. Daniel was worse. He was beginning to fear me. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, the way his hands fidgeted whenever I spoke. He was unraveling faster than I expected. But I wasn't done yet, because soon, I was going to break them. Completely. Paranoia is a slow, creeping poison. It doesn't take hold all at once. It seeps into the mind, inch by inch, turning thoughts into doubts, turning simple gestures into threats. And Hannah and Daniel? They were drowning in it. I woke up early that morning, just in time to hear their hushed voices in the hallway. "I don't know, Daniel," Hannah whispered, her voice sharp with irritation. "You're imagining things." A pause. A heavy breath. Then Daniel's low, uneasy reply. "No, I'm not. He knows something. I can feel it." I smiled to myself. Good. I made a little more noise than necessary as I stepped out of the bedroom. Hannah and Daniel immediately pulled apart. "Morning," I said casually, stretching. "You two seem tense. Something wrong?" Hannah forced a smile, shaking her head. "No, of course not." Daniel stayed silent. He was already cracking. That night, I set my next trap. A simple one. Before bed, I accidentally left my laptop open on the kitchen counter, the screen displaying a search history. Signs your spouse is cheating, how to catch a liar, hidden cameras in the home, best locations. Then I waited. I stayed in bed, pretending to be asleep, listening to the house settle. And then footsteps, soft, careful, trying not to wake me. They stopped in the kitchen. Silence. Then the sharp inhale of someone realizing they've been caught. I almost laughed. The next morning, Hannah was off. She barely spoke over breakfast, picking at her food. Daniel avoided looking at me entirely. I took a sip of my coffee and leaned back in my chair. "I was thinking," I said, tapping my fingers against the table. "We should take a vacation. Just the two of us." Hannah's head snapped up. "What?" she asked a little too quickly. "A vacation," I repeated, my voice calm. "Get away from everything. Spend some time together. What do you think?" She opened her mouth, hesitated, then forced a smile. "That's a great idea." But her hands were shaking. Daniel cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. He knew. A vacation for us meant he'd be left behind. He was running out of time. And soon, he would make a mistake. I just had to wait. The walls were closing in. Hannah and Daniel could feel it. They weren't sure why, weren't sure how, but something had changed. The air between us was thicker now, the silences heavier. I could see it in their stiff smiles, their restless hands, the way their eyes flicked toward each other when they thought I wasn't looking. They were waiting for something to happen. They just didn't know when, or how badly it would destroy them. That night, I set another trap. I walked into the living room, stretching like I was exhausted. "Long day," I muttered. "I think I'll turn in early." Hannah smiled, too relieved, too eager. "That's a good idea," she said quickly. Daniel barely reacted. He just nodded. I went to the bedroom, turned off the lights, and then I waited. Took exactly 23 minutes. Footsteps. Soft, careful Hannah's. Then another set, Daniel's. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. Then whispers. "I don't know, Daniel," Hannah murmured, her voice tight. "Something is off. He's been acting different." Daniel sighed. "I told you. He knows something." Hannah exhaled sharply.
No.
No, if he knew, he would have confronted me already. I smirked in the darkness. "You really think so?" Daniel hesitated. "Then why is he suddenly talking about a vacation?" Hannah was silent. She didn't have an answer, because she was finally realizing she didn't know me at all. The next morning, I pretended like nothing happened. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself some coffee, and stretched. "You know, I had the weirdest dream last night," I said casually. Hannah froze. Daniel stiffened. I hid my smirk behind my coffee cup. "I dreamt that I heard you two talking," I continued, looking at them both. "Whispering about secrets. About me." Daniel swallowed hard. "That's, weird." Hannah forced a laugh. Too loud. "That is weird. Maybe your mind is playing tricks on you." I set my coffee down, leaning forward slightly. "Maybe." I let the moment stretch, let the tension coil tighter and tighter. Then I smiled. Or maybe I was awake. Hannah paled. Daniel gripped the table, and I sat back, sipping my coffee, enjoying the fear in their eyes. They were breaking, and soon, I was going to shatter them. Hannah barely spoke to me that day. Her usual affectionate gestures, smiling at me over breakfast, resting her hand on my shoulder as she passed, were gone. Instead, she moved through the house like a ghost, distracted, worried. Daniel? He was worse. He couldn't even look at me. Good. They were falling apart, and I was enjoying every second of it. That night, I made my next move. Hannah and Daniel were sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV. I stepped in, stretching lazily. Hey, I wanted to ask you both something. Hannah tensed. Yeah. I kept my tone casual. Have either of you noticed anything weird around the house? Daniel's grip on his glass tightened. Weird how? I exhaled, rubbing my chin. I don't know. Just little things. I let my gaze flicker between them, slow, deliberate, like hearing whispers at night, or objects being moved. Hannah's breathing hitched. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I smiled slightly. Maybe I'm just imagining things. Silence. Then Hannah forced a laugh. That's crazy. I tilted my head. Is it? She swallowed. Of course. Daniel cleared his throat. You're probably just tired, man. I let my gaze linger on him for a second longer than necessary. Yeah, maybe. Then I turned and walked away, leaving them alone with their panic. Hours later, I checked the hidden camera feed from my laptop. I had placed a single device in the living room weeks ago, tucked between books on the shelf, disguised as a charger. It wasn't fancy, just enough to see and hear everything. And tonight, captured exactly what I wanted. Hannah sat stiffly on the couch, arms crossed, her leg bouncing. Daniel leaned forward, whispering, "What if he knows?" Hannah's voice was sharp. "He doesn't." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "He's acting weird. That thing about whispers? You don't think he's—" Hannah cut him off. "No. He's just messing with us." Daniel wasn't convinced. "He's never talked like that before." Hannah exhaled hard. "You're paranoid." Daniel shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe he's playing with us." Silence. Then Hannah's voice low, worried. "We need to be more careful." I smirked at the screen. Too late. The next morning, I poured my coffee, pretending not to notice the way Hannah avoided my gaze. Daniel excused himself early, saying he had things to do. I simply sipped my drink, letting the silence choke her. Finally, I leaned against the counter, watching her. "You seem tense," I said. She gave me a thin smile. "Just tired." I nodded. "You should be more careful." Her fingers tightened around her mug. "What do you mean?" I held her gaze, letting the moment stretch. Then I shrugged. "Just that it's easy to slip up when you're not paying attention." I saw the panic flash in her eyes before she forced it away. She didn't know if it was a coincidence or a warning. Let her wonder. The tension in the house had shifted. Before, it had been my tension, the silent pressure of knowing the truth while pretending I didn't. Now it was theirs. Hannah was unraveling. She spent less and less time in the same room as me, always finding an excuse to keep herself busy, always checking her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. Daniel was worse. He barely spoke at all. And when he did, his voice was tight, uncertain. He had stopped making eye contact altogether. They thought they were being hunted. They were right. That night, I turned the screws even further. I left small clues around the house, subtle, but just enough to poke at their paranoia. I moved Daniel's toothbrush to the far side of the bathroom sink. I took one of Hannah's earrings from the bedroom and left it on the kitchen counter. I adjusted the chair in the living room, only slightly, just enough for them to wonder if it had been touched. They noticed. I could see it. Daniel stared at his toothbrush for too long, his expression tight with suspicion. Hannah picked up her earring with shaking fingers, her breathing uneven. And the chair? Neither of them sat down in it. They were trapped in their own guilt, and I was the one tightening the noose. The real fun began later that night. I waited until 2 a.m., then crept out of bed and moved silently toward the living room. Daniel's door was closed, but Hannah's? Slightly ajar. I pushed it open just enough. Then I stood there, watching, waiting. After a few seconds, Hannah stirred in her sleep. A shift, a small sound. Then her eyes fluttered open. She must have felt me there. She turned her head slightly toward the door, and for a brief, perfect moment, our eyes met. She gasped. I didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, letting her feel it. Then, after a long, agonizing moment, I turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her racing heart. The next morning, Hannah looked like she hadn't slept. Dark circles under her eyes, tense shoulders, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. Daniel noticed. He frowned. You okay? She glanced at me. Then, shaking her head, she muttered, Yeah, just bad dreams. I smirked. She wasn't dreaming. She was breaking. And soon, I would shatter her completely. Hannah was at her limit. She barely spoke, barely ate. Every noise made her flinch. Every glance I threw her way sent waves of fear through her entire body. Daniel wasn't doing much better. He had started leaving the house for long stretches, probably to escape me. Probably to convince himself that he still had control over the situation. But he didn't. I did. And now, it was time to end this. That evening, I set the final stage. Hannah was in the shower. Daniel was in his room, probably pacing, probably trying to decide if he should leave before it was too late. I took her phone from the kitchen counter, unlocked it, and I sent one message. Me, pretending to be Hannah *, come to the back porch. We need to talk. Alone. *. I put the phone back exactly where I found it. Then I waited. 15 minutes later, Daniel stepped outside. I was already there, sitting in one of the chairs, waiting for him. His face dropped the second he saw me. Expecting someone else? I asked smoothly. Daniel hesitated. I just needed some fresh air. I smirked, nodding slowly. Right? Fresh air. Silence. The air was thick with tension. Daniel shifted on his feet, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You know, I continued, swirling the drink in my hand, I've been thinking a lot about loyalty, about trust. Daniel swallowed hard. Yeah. I leaned forward slightly. Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? You live with someone, you let them into your home, and the whole time, I paused, letting my gaze lock onto his. They're betraying you. Daniel paled. I don't know what you're talking about, man, he stammered, stepping back slightly. I smiled. Don't you? He was crumbling. I could see it in his trembling hands, in the way his breath hitched every time I spoke. But I wasn't done yet. I reached into my pocket, and I pulled out my phone. One tap. The screen lit up. The video began playing. Hannah, Daniel, together, in my house, in my bed, his face drained of color. I've known, I said, my voice deathly calm. For a long time, Daniel's lips parted, but no words came out. I let the video play for a few more seconds before shutting it off. Then I stood up, stepping toward him. His feet wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, trapped like an animal staring down a predator. I leaned in close. Pack your things, I whispered, and get the hell out of my house. Daniel left within the hour. Hannah found out moments later, emerging from the shower, wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping wet, only to see him dragging a suitcase toward the door. Daniel? She gasped, eyes wide. What's going on? He didn't answer. He couldn't even look at her. And then she saw me, standing in the hallway, watching. I tilted my head, smiled. You should pack too. She went completely still. What? She whispered. You heard me? I said, stepping forward. Get out. Hannah's breathing turned ragged. Jake, baby, what's happening? I reached into my pocket again, pulled out my phone, and I hit play. Hannah's face collapsed. Her legs buckled, and she gripped the doorframe for support, shaking her head in disbelief. No, please. Her voice was barely a whisper. I stared at her, completely calm, completely detached. This is what you wanted, isn't it? I asked softly. You wanted to be with him, right? Tears pooled in her eyes. No. It wasn't like that. I laughed. A cold, empty sound. Don't lie to me, Hannah. Not anymore. She broke. Completely. Her knees hit the floor, her hands clasping together like a woman praying for mercy. Please, Jake, she sobbed. Don't do this. I made a mistake. I didn't mean to. I crouched down in front of her, gripping her chin between my fingers. You meant to. Her lip trembled. You just never thought you'd get caught. Hannah let out a strangled sob, her whole body shaking. I released her, stood up, and I pointed to the door. Leave. I watched as Hannah packed her bags, her hands fumbling with every zipper, her breath shaky as she shoved clothes into a suitcase. She kept glancing at me, begging silently, but I just leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting. Finally, she turned to me, tears streaking down her face. Where will I go? She whispered. I shrugged. Not my problem. And then, without another word, I opened the door. She stepped out into the cold night air, clutching her suitcase to her chest, looking like she wanted to say something. But nothing would fix this. Nothing ever would. I shut the door, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The house was quiet. For the first time in months, blissfully quiet. No more whispered conversations behind my back. No more stolen glances. No more pretending I didn't see the way she touched him when she thought I wasn't looking. Just silence. I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the empty space where her suitcase had been just moments ago. The air still carried the faint scent of her perfume, but it was fading, just like she was. I didn't feel regret, not even a little. She had dug this grave herself. And Daniel? He got off easy. I could have done worse, much worse. But revenge wasn't about rage. It wasn't about violence. It was about control. And I had controlled this from the moment I realized what was happening. Hannah thought she had been sneaking around, thought she was being clever, covering her tracks, spinning her lies. But I had been orchestrating everything. From the moment I let Daniel move in, to the subtle mind games, to the final reveal, it had all been leading to this. She was gone, and I was still standing. I poured myself a drink, sat on the couch, let the moment sink in. I thought about what came next. Hannah had nowhere to go. Her parents wouldn't take her in, not after seeing the video. Her friends, the ones she hadn't already pushed away, would only keep her at arm's length, whispering behind her back. Daniel wouldn't take her either, not after what I had done to them. She was truly alone now. And I was free. I slept better that night than I had in years. No tossing and turning. No gnawing suspicion keeping me awake. Just deep, uninterrupted peace. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the empty side of the bed. It didn't bother me, because for the first time in a long time, I had my house back, and it was mine alone. Morning came, crisp and peaceful. The house no longer felt suffocating. It no longer carried the weight of secrets lurking in every corner, whispers clinging to the walls like ghosts. I took my time getting up. No rache, no tension, no pretending. Hannah was gone. And now, it was time to make sure she stayed that way. I spent the day erasing her. Her clothes? Gone. Every forgotten blouse, every stray hair tie left behind. I packed them into a bag and tossed it onto the curb. Her photos? Deleted. Off my phone, off the walls, off the shelves. She didn't exist here anymore. By evening, the house felt clean, like it had been purged of something rotten. But there was still one last thing to do. I sent Hannah a single text. Me. Asterisk, the divorce papers will be delivered tomorrow. Sign them and don't contact me again. Asterisk.
No greetings. No explanations.
Just the end. She read it immediately. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. I smirked. She knew. There was nothing left to say. That night, I poured myself a drink, stepped onto the back porch, and let the cool air settle over me. A week ago, I had stood in this very spot, watching Daniel try to lie to my face. Now they were both gone, and I was still standing. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of it all lift. I had won. The next morning, the lawyer confirmed it. The papers were signed. Hannah was legally, officially, permanently out of my life. No more lies, no more betrayal, just me. And it had never felt better. The divorce was finalized a week later. No drawn-out fights.
No desprit, please.
Hannah signed the papers without a word, probably because she knew there was no way back. She had already lost everything. Her marriage, her home, her reputation. And Daniel? He had disappeared too. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he left town, probably hoping to escape the humiliation I had carved into his life. Coward. But I didn't care, because I wasn't looking back anymore. I spent the next few months rebuilding. Not my house. It was already mine, stripped of every trace of her. But myself. I focused on my work, picked up old hobbies, started going to the gym, pushing my body to its limits, channeling every ounce of rage and betrayal into something that made me stronger. And eventually, I started dating again, not because I needed someone, but because I refused to let what Hannah did make me afraid to trust again. She wasn't that powerful.